If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Please be seated. And I should have done this earlier service, so my apologies, folks. I didn't. I want to give you an update from our last episode of our move here. Just so you know, we are moved in, and actually I unpacked the very last boxes yesterday that were in the garage. That's a huge victory. Yes, thank you. I never knew how much I dislike cardboard. But it's been an interesting week as we kind of launch in here because on Thursday I had a wonderful meeting with some folks here at the church, and afterwards Patrick and I decided to go over to the bank, where immediately we got into a brawl. I'm kidding, no we didn't. No, we were there, and I'm like, man, my back hurts really bad, and I'm sweating. And I looked over at Jen and I said, I think I have a stone, because I've had it twice before. But so anyway, we go home, and I'm like, I'll just drink a bunch of water, see what happens. Around 5 o'clock, and nobody told me this here, the hospital, I live in Palmetto Halls, the hospital by me probably wasn't the best choice, at least. And so I got there, and they did some tests. They said, you don't have a stone. And so then they put me in an ultrasound, and 4 hours later, they said, oh, you have a stone. And they put me on morphine and some other things, and so I was able to come home that night. But around 11:30, but between 5 o'clock when I got there and 11:30, we get a phone call from my daughter. You see, we were having our house repiped. Some of you know exactly what that's about. As we were having our house repiped, the men left, and a water leak broke in the house, as Jen and I are at the emergency room, which, with a 17-year-old daughter who is a very capable young lady, that's still a lot to ask of her. So we're calling her and FaceTiming her, and while we're in the emergency room, going back and forth. And so they showed up with a crew who was there till about 2 in the morning, and they got it taken care of. And so then yesterday, we're ready for everything to calm down. And my Shih Tzu, not mine, I don't want to own him. He's my wife's Shih Tzu, her little dog. I have a Labrador, which makes me superior. He has an affection for an armadillo that lives under our porch. And whenever he goes under there and gets dirty, I take him and I throw him in the pool because I don't want a dirty dog in the house. Well, he's caught on to this. He's smarter than I thought. And he knew it was about to happen, and he jumped up and bit me. I was thinking, Lord, if this couldn't get any worse. So all that to say is, I liked the stone that I have so much. I brought it to church with me today because I haven't passed it yet. So it's with us. So it's been an interesting week, but all to say, everything has settled down for the most part, I suppose. Okay, that's enough about me. Remembering the first time you heard something is usually based on your level of interest in that information. And now, as we're into the month of September, most of you probably remember hearing the initial report from September 11th. It has replaced the question, where were you when JFK was killed? Now it's, where were you when 9/11 happened? I recall that I was in seminary driving from our home in Moline, Illinois, to where the seminary is in Dubuque, Iowa. And I was driving my Chrysler LeBaron, wasn't the nicest car I've ever owned, listening to Iowa Public Radio, as was my habit, when I heard that Flight 11 had just hit the North Tower. And of course, we don't know what's going on at the time. I remember they saying they thought it was a private plane at first. And I continued to listen. It was about an hour and a half to get to seminary. And I was about halfway there, and about 17 minutes later, Flight 175 hit the South Tower, and we all knew something else was going on. And I did what a lot of people did that day. Rather than go to school, I turned around and I went home to be with my family. Because of the actions of terrible people who were void of anything good, my life as well as yours, to greater and lesser degrees, They've been changed since that day. And I do want to put a shameless plug in here. On September 11th, a week from tomorrow, I'll be speaking at the Being Men of Christ, the BMOC gathering, and I'll be sharing some reflections of heroism and faith that I've seen during my 3+ years in combat since September 11th. And similarly, in our gospel text for this morning, Jesus is about to reveal some information that will change his disciples' lives forever. He had previously dropped some clues about his impending death. However, Jesus shows, as it's translated in our Bible verse today, he shows them something. And what he's showing them is that his disciples, that he will go to Jerusalem, suffer at the hands of the religious leaders, and be killed, and on the third day rise again. The word shows there literally means reveals. They've not known it up until this point. Jesus revealed to his disciples for the first time with great clarity what they should expect in the days ahead. He'll do more of this later in chapters 20 and 26, and he'll unpack what this means with greater detail in those, but it doesn't undo the shock of the initial proclamation. He is announcing to his disciples his very own death sentence. It's almost incomprehensible for us to conceive how strange and unbelievable this revelation must have seemed to his disciples. Upon hearing this statement, Peter takes Jesus aside, and it's safe to assume that this new revelation has everybody just as upset as Peter is. This is the first time they're hearing about his forthcoming death without equivocation. Peter is adamant that this will never happen to Jesus. This is completely within Peter's character. And just for an aside, I see my children here. We're watching the show The Chosen. And for those of you who don't know the show The Chosen, it's good. It's a very good depiction of Jesus and the first disciples. It's worth watching. But the casting team's choice of Peter, in my opinion, is near perfect. He's built like he's like a CrossFit coach or running back, and he tends to speak before he thinks things through. And I think it's a fair representation of Peter before the death and resurrection of Jesus. When you read the epistles of Peter, which of course come later in Peter's life, you find the same fire and the same gusto, but it's endued with maturity and wisdom. In verse 23, we have one of the few indications of body language in the Gospels. We actually have choreography going on here. It's a further sign that the story was recollected by someone who was there when it happened. Matthew, our writer, was there. He saw this take place. Here it says, Jesus turns to Peter and offers a stern rebuke. But I want you to put yourself in Peter's shoes right now. Just before this episode, Peter proclaims that Jesus is the Son of the living God. And Jesus, in a very personal way, says, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah." He uses his full name in a good way. It's not like when your mother said your middle name when she was calling for you. This is kind. Jesus has just been revealed as the Messiah. And so at this point, the obvious solution would be to march on Jerusalem, gather as many like-minded Jews as you could along the way, choose your moment, say your prayers, fight a surprise battle, take over the temple, and install Jesus as king. But as you know, that's not what happened. What happens is that Jesus announces his execution. Peter attempts to correct him, and Jesus calls him, of all things, Satan. No Simon Bar-Jonah, but just Satan. Think how much this must have wounded Peter personally. One commentator puts it this way: there is no parallel to such an address to another human being. In Hebrew, the word Satan means literally opponent. Jesus is looking Peter straight in the face and saying, "Peter, you are my opponent." I think Peter and the disciples are looking at their situation, realizing that there are a lot of insurrectionists that end up dead. And it's normal for the Romans to go after the followers once they've killed the leader. Therefore, if Jesus is going to Jerusalem to suffer, and although he doesn't say how he will suffer, only that he will suffer, and he doesn't even mention the cross as it applies to himself here. If Jesus is going to suffer and to be put to death, then what should his disciples expect to happen to them? Now in verse 24, it gets more personal. Jesus tells us that anybody, and by anybody he means you and I now, that anybody who seeks to follow him must do three things. First, deny yourself. Second, take up your cross. And third, follow Jesus. So you're to deny yourself, pick up your cross, and follow Jesus. 1 and 3 are mostly self-explanatory. Deny yourself and follow Jesus. However, the cryptic nature of the second, pick up your cross, that would have sounded very strange to the disciples to tell them, when they have no idea that Jesus is going to be crucified, to tell them to pick up your cross. What in the world does that mean? Because at this moment, the disciples have no idea that Jesus will be crucified because he hasn't told them how he will die. Remember, it's the religious leaders that he attributes his forthcoming death. They can't crucify him. Only the state, the Romans, have the authority to crucify, and Jesus hasn't mentioned them. And after all, to be crucified is to be defeated. Peter had just acknowledged that Jesus is Lord. How could they possibly be defeated? Just as James and Peter left everything at the seashore to follow Jesus, now he's asking them to save their lives by giving up their lives. And by the way, Jesus will soon suffer and die, he's telling them. That's a huge commitment. So here Jesus is not only preparing the disciples for the road ahead, but also for the forthcoming church. Think about the first generations of Christians who were in the Colosseum and in the arena with the animals and with the gladiators. The chronology is striking. Jesus tells his disciples to take up their cross before revealing to them that cross, the cross, will be his instrument of execution. The cross will be where he takes his last breath. But again, they don't know this yet. Jesus doesn't even explain what it means to take up your cross here. But he does tell them, and this is what's important to us, he does tell them what's at stake. What would you give up for your own soul? He asks that of people everywhere on earth today. What would you give up for your own soul? That term soul means life. In our modern world, the concept of finding yourself and getting in touch with your true self is often the highest good, even when that true self, so to speak, turns out to be disconnected from any reality. In our modern Western world, understanding your real self often means listening to whatever desire is most prevalent with you at any moment, without regard to any consequences in your own life or in the lives of others. Jesus offers you something better. If you want to find yourself, then give your life to the God who made you, and let him reveal to you what you were made to be. God is constant, God is unchanging, and God is good. Unlike our fickle human preferences that are changing from day to day, God can be trusted. The wordplay in our text continues. What does it matter if you gain the whole world and lose your soul? That too is a death sentence. It's paradoxical. Gain the world and die, or die to yourself and gain the world. It sounds like a riddle. First, we have Jesus announcing his death sentence. Then he asks all who follow him to accept their own death sentence. Death sentences are never good news. Nobody was ever excited to get a death sentence. And despite the occasional bravado, the convicted is scared of what lies ahead. I had a student in the Neshoda house who asked me to do a direct study with the individual. I would take one student on a term for direct study. And I chose this student because they were doing this individual's a chaplain on death row in Nashville. And so I found their story fascinating. And as things play out, what she shared with me was initially when she would meet people at death row, they always say they're innocent. They're all innocent. That is until they have to do what's called the long walk to execution. And once they become aware of that, things change. And that last walk, she said, oftentimes is very deep, it's very sad, but it's also sometimes where people finally were converted, realizing that this is the end. Similarly, in April 2017, I had the opportunity as part of a doctoral course to sit in on the Dylan Roof sentencing phase of his trial. Some of you might know whom I'm talking about when I say Dylan Roof. His names and actions, I imagine, are pretty well known here in the Low Country, as it was just down the road in Charleston that Roof walked in one day into Mother Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, sat through a Bible study, and as our brothers and sisters in Christ bowed their heads in prayer, he began shooting. Los Angeles Times reporter and Pulitzer Prize winner Kevin Stack sat next to me during the sentencing phase. The judge read the guilty verdict, gave him a death sentence, and as I recall, Roof's response was apathetic at best. In fact, I remember some of the words he said. You know how a family gets to make remarks. He looked at the family and he said, evil, you don't know what evil is. My new reporter acquaintance, Kevin, was visibly shaken. He's at least then was a non-observant Jew. He said that he'd never seen evil like that before. Said something to the effect that it was if there was no good left in Dylan Roof. That absence of good is the understanding that evil, unlike good, is insubstantial. So thinking of it as an entity is misleading. Instead, evil is the absence or the lack of good. I agreed with Kevin. That's what we observed that day. Evil is apathy. Evil is void. Satan and all the powers of hell are void of all goodness. Again, focusing on our gospel text today, we have two death sentences. Jesus announces his, and he calls us to ours. If your primary concern in this life is to get the most out of it in pleasure and satisfaction and enjoyment, you will end up losing everything if that pleasure, satisfaction, and enjoyment comes from the world. Doing so is apathy toward real life. It's apathy toward the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's a deliberative privation of the good he's offering you, a much better good, a longer lasting good. It's what the book of Revelation calls the second death. It's there that St. John writes, "But as for the cowardly, the faithless, the detestable, as for murderers, the sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars, their portion will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death." It's the ultimate apathy. It's the absence of all goodness. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in his well-known book, Life Together, wrote that when Christ calls a man, he bids him to come and die. If you lose your life for Jesus' sake, you bravely and in the faith accept the fact, the death sentence, to die to yourself. If you dedicate it all to him, follow his guidance, obey his instructions, however imperfectly, you're not going to do it, neither will I, as well as he did. You will live a meaningful life, and God-pleasing life in this world, and still enjoy all the blessings of the new heaven and the new earth. You'll have a reprieve from the second death. So please hear me on this so I'm clear. You won't have earned a heavenly reward by the life you lead, but neither will you allow the world, the flesh, and the devil to deprive you of the blessings that Jesus is now offering you. Or to put it as St. Paul did in our epistle reading from Romans, present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Following him will cost you everything and will give everything. There are no half measures on this journey. Cling to your own life and you'll lose it. Give everything to Jesus, including life itself, and you will win it. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.